At Stort Valley Club, it's become a custom to invite Peter Blaskos, our most senior member, to give us his words of wisdom at the start of the evening. So can I invite Peter to say his few words of wisdom?
Yes, good evening. And first, can you all hear me? And are you sitting comfortably?
Yes, we can hear you.
Then I'll begin. I've tried to avoid the coronavirus tonight. So let's have the thought for today then. Have you not in your wallet seen those fivers and tenors all pristine? If you go to try, they're no good for shopping or even buying with online hopping. So what is money? I've often wondered. It's a mystery into which I blundered. They used to count money in the till. Now governments quantitatively ease at will. Banks appear to lend what they haven't got. But if you go into debt, you're on the spot. How has money fared in recent history? Our speaker, Anne, will tackle this mystery.
Thanks very much, Peter. Your words are always very welcome. So I'd like now to introduce our speaker for this evening, Professor Anne Murphy. As well as Professor of History, Anne is Dean of the School of Humanities at the University of Hertfordshire. History at the university has an excellent reputation, and at the last independent assessment was ranked one of the best departments in the UK. We are so privileged to have such an amazing institution on our doorstep. Anne's subject tonight will be bankers. What have they ever done for us? A subject she is well qualified to talk about after spending 12 years working in the City of London. So I'll now hand over to you, Anne.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to try and share my screen so that you can see, hopefully, my PowerPoint. And then, good. I am hoping now. Good. Can you see that okay? Yep. Excellent. Right. We shall begin. And thank you to Peter for that wonderful introduction, which raised many of the questions I think that I'm going to talk about, particularly what is money, what meaning does it have, and the question of what finance and banking have ever done for us, whether they actually work in the interests of the ordinary people or not. So I'm a financial historian, and as Gordon said, I used to work in the city many years ago. I was a derivatives trader for a number of years after leaving school, until I thought better of it and decided to go to university instead. At university, I discovered finance from a different angle, finance from the angle of the historical, which I found extremely intriguing. A financial historian does a variety of things. What I tend to do is to look at how people have engaged with finance in the past. So how finance has worked for the ordinary individual, why people used banks, why people used financial instruments, and what difference it made for their lives. So I'm not really interested so much at the level of institutions. I'm interested in what ordinary people did, interested in institutions at the level of process and how they operate. One of the things that I'm doing at the moment is working on a history of the Bank of England that looks at precisely how it worked across a day. So I'm taking a 24-hour span and looking at its opening routines, how it managed work throughout the day, what the clerks were like, what kind of skills they had, what people who used the bank were actually doing. What I want to do today is pull out a little bit and try to take a bigger view of these kinds of issues, and to think about why finance gets such a bad press, and it very often does, and particularly bankers get a bad press, and whether that is a really accurate representation. Should we think of finance in that way, or are there other ways of thinking of finance? Well, finance, as we know, does get a bad press on regular occasions. It does this often because it doesn't seem to produce anything. It feels destructive very often. It entices people into debt. It exacts huge penalties on those people who fail to pay their debts, to the point where they become destroyed, they become bankrupt, they're not able to engage in what the rest of us need to do when these things happen to us. Banks are often too volatile. They seem to very quickly make money, but also very quickly lose money, and there doesn't seem to be any rhyme nor reason for why these things are occurring. So they are viewed poorly because of all of these factors. They're also viewed poorly, and I think we need to remember this, because our religions, the religions that we are brought up with, tell us to view finance poorly. There's nothing more difficult. It's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. We are told in stories, in religious iconography, to avoid greed, to be thrifty, to be generous to charities, but not to try to accumulate wealth for ourselves. And those bankers, those individuals who are just about the manipulation of wealth, they are very problematic. Are these fair representations? Well, sometimes, of course, yes. Finance can create many evils and many significant problems, both at the level of nationhood, but also for individuals. But this is not the full story. So we need to ask, what have bankers ever done for us? And we need here to recognize that complex financial organization is extremely necessary for any significant development. So you can't build cities without complex financial organization. You can't have an industrial revolution without complex finance. That you might say that's fair enough, but that's the history of capitalism, isn't it? And capitalism is an exploitative system. And we might want to reject the idea of an exploitative system. So I'll offer you another example. You can't defend your country without complex finance. War very often is not about military might. War is about your financial capacity, and has been about your financial capacity for quite a significant time now. Finance is actually the key foundation for successful warfare. Well, again, fair enough, you might say, we might be better off without wars. Maybe if we weren't able to finance wars, we wouldn't be able to fight with each other. So I'll offer you another example. You can't democratize without finance. Democratization, both at the level of national politics, but also individual agency, the ability of all of us to act for ourselves, can't happen without high finance. High finance is necessary. And a little bit later on, I'll use the example of independence for women, both within and outside of marriage. But we can also think about things like social security and pensions and personal savings, affordable loans and mortgages, all of those sorts of things that give us the right to own our own houses, to go to university, how to consume. All of those things help us understand that finance is essential. So finance is essential for a process of spreading wealth across the country, making sure that it doesn't just stay in the hands of the elites. So let's try and take some examples to illustrate this. And I'm going to use some early modern examples because I'm a 17th and 18th century historian, and also because I think 17th and 18th century history is an interesting place to start because it's the birthplace of complex financial organization. It's the place where real banking starts with goldsmiths, bankers in London in the 17th century, but then more complex banking in the 18th century. It's the place where you start to get the first joint stock companies, the first stock markets, the first complex government finance. So the 17th and 18th century is the first time when the British government, at least, is starting to borrow huge amounts of money. So finance is really born in complex ways around this period. So where do we start with? We start with what finance does for the merchant. So you can see here, hopefully on my slide, the various different colonial and European and global trading routes that were in use through the 17th, 18th and into the 19th and then into the 20th. How much time it takes merchants to go from Europe to the places that they really wanted to take goods from. And this is particularly India and Southeast Asia around this period of time. The problem is it takes an awful long time to get from Europe through to Asia, and then it takes an awful long time to get back again afterwards. You have to wait for the right weather, you have to wait for sea routes to be appropriate. It takes months. So if you're investing, you are going to lose your money. Your money is going to disappear for a significant length of time. You've got to figure out then ways of borrowing and lending effectively that allow you to engage in very, very long distance and long time span transactions without you feeling that you are illiquid, that you are too poor in the meantime. You can't give away all your money and then wait for 2 years to get it back. That's impossible. What happens if you need that money in the meantime? If your daughter wants to get married and you need to provide a dowry, if there's an emergency at home and you need to liquidate your funds. So figuring out ways of making this work is really one of the foundations of complex finance. And it's one of the things that money and bankers can do for us. They help us shift money through time and space. And this is really important. It's a real key to a modern economy, being able to shift money through time and space. Why can't you do this with real money? Well, you can't do this with real money as in gold and silver, things that hold a physical intrinsic value. It's too risky to send them off. So too risky to fill up your ships with gold and silver. What if they sink? What if they're attacked by pirates or privateers? These sorts of things are happening regularly. So you start to use credit transactions, paper money, and that fills the gaps because banks help you borrow against that paper money. The other thing that you need complex money for when trade is developing in the 17th and 18th century is infrastructure. Now, complex trade, especially to Africa and also to India, required infrastructure to be built. So it required forts, it required warehouses, it required individuals to guard those as well. So it was expensive. You needed to raise money. And this is where joint stock companies come in. It's only through the raising of money through the issuing of shares that they can start generating enough money to support trade over a long period of time. So where do we go next? Well, one of the ways that they're raising all of this money is through bills of exchange. Like your IOU, you can exchange it with somebody else, and that gives a commitment that in 3 months' time or in 6 months' time, you get your money back. But what happens in the meantime? In the meantime, you can take your bill of exchange to a place like this. So this is the Bank of England in the 18th century. This is the great banking hall of the Bank of England. You can see it's a very impressive space. It's one of the characteristics of bankers and banking is that they try to create very impressive spaces that demonstrate that your money is secure with them. So you can take your IOU to the Bank of England and you can lend it to the Bank of England for a period of time at a discounted rate. So they'll charge you a rate of interest for it and you can get your money straight away. And this is another important characteristic of banking and finance, is that it can take an instrument that has a notional value, a piece of paper, and it can create additional value out of it. So it can take something that represents value and it can lend you money against it. And banks use this as a way to generate additional money and additional funds. It's one of the things they get criticized for. It's one of the things that quantitative easing does. It creates money. And you can create money in problematic ways, which is maybe what quantitative easing does, but you can also create money in very productive ways, which is what discounting bills of exchange, lending money on these pieces of paper we're doing. And this was part of the process of growing the economy in London and in the provinces as well in the 18th century. The Bank of England stood at the center of an edifice that allowed money to grow and develop, that allowed a small amount of physical capital to become a large amount of credit upon which an economy and an imperial power grew as well. Now, the Bank of England is a really important part of all of this because it's creating a space where all of this business can happen. But it's also creating a space that conveys credibility. And this again is another important factor in what banks do. They have to tell us that they are credible. It's one of the failures that we have at the moment, that banks struggle to convey their credibility to us. We're starting to lose faith in them. For the Bank of England in the 18th century, it was definitely a store. It was a repository of faith for individuals, probably more so than the government at this point. And it signals its ability to support this activity. It signals its faithfulness, its credibility through everything that it does. So if you just look at the space that is being, it's large, it has all sorts of iconography around it that demonstrate how important the bank is. So the statue right at the far end is one of William III, who is the king when the Bank of England is established in 1694. And the bank is saying, we have a connection to monarchy. Just outside, so you see on the right-hand side of the screen, the big door there. If we looked outside the bank, over that door is a statue of Britannia. And it's a statue of Britannia with a cornucopia pouring out the fruits of her labor that represent the labor of Britain. Britannia also is a symbol of the defense of Britain. And what the Bank of England is conveying here is the interrelated nature of itself and the defense of the nation. The bank is, is the thing that helps the nation defend itself. The other way that it does this is through helping the state raise money for wars. And the Bank of England is an integral part of this. This also reflects the changed character of warfare in the 18th century, where war becomes about the person, the country who can raise the most amount of money. Very few countries have a technical advantage at this point. So the 17th and 18th century, most countries are using the same sorts of technologies, both for their armies and for their navies. The countries that win wars tend to be the countries that are still standing at the end of a long period of fighting wars. So as this quote by Charles Davenant says, the whole art of war is reduced to money, and it's the prince who can best pay his army that is surest of conquest. That doesn't quite work when we get to the American Revolution, but that's because the Americans cheat. But in all other circumstances in the 18th century, it's about strong finance. And the British do this better. Particularly, they do it better than the French. And the French is the foe throughout most of the 18th and into the 19th century. Interestingly, the British are doing this by raising money from ordinary people. So this is people like you and me who are happy to raise money for the state. And as you can see here, this is not only a problem for the British. So this is a Dutch image. It's the fight of the money bags and the coffers. And you can see that war is being waged, not by soldiers, not by individuals, but by bags of money and coffers of money who are clashing. The Dutch do this reasonably well. Probably the Dutch do this first as well. But the British eventually managed to raise war finance better. And here you can see how much money in the end is being raised by the British over the course of the 18th century. So over the 18th century, the British are fighting wars on a very regular basis. And this is the amount of debt that's been accumulated. We've heard quite a bit in the last couple of weeks about the amount of debt that we're accumulating to fight coronavirus. In the 18th century, nobody much cared about fighting disease. If you got a disease, you died. But they did care about fighting wars. They did care about raising debt to fight wars. The very far side, again to the right of the screen, what you can see there is the amount of debt that had to be raised to fight off the French Revolutionary and then Napoleonic armies. By the time you get to 1815, there is over £800 million worth of debt. If you measure it by GDP, by gross domestic product, Britain was probably more indebted in 1815 than she has ever been since. And that debt was funded by ordinary individuals. And that meant that those ordinary individuals had to trust the state. So they had to trust that the state would pay interest. They had to trust that the state would look after their money. And they had to trust that the state would use it wisely. I'm guessing if we asked anybody today about whether we would trust the state to use our money wisely, we might raise a few more eyebrows. But in the 18th century, people trusted that the state would use their money wisely and that they would pay their interest. Despite the fact that what the state was using this money for was fighting wars. And this persists. There's a hiatus throughout most of the 19th century where the state is not fighting wars on a regular basis, or if it is, it's fighting rather cheaper wars. But when we get back to the expensive wars of the 20th century, people once again are convinced to lend the state money in order to fight their wars. And they are convinced that investing in the British war machine, or indeed the American war machine, as we'll see in a minute, these kinds of schemes are rolled out all across the world. Turning your silver into bullets at the post office is something that resonates with individuals. And it's a very necessary part of both winning the First World War, but also winning the Second World War. Without ordinary people's finance without the ability to finance, then the outcomes could have been very different. I've got a couple more of these war posters just because they're one of my minor obsessions. I always think the messages that they send are terribly interesting. So the next three are American ones, because the Americans do the best kind of war posters. Here is, you know, doing all you can, brother, is a kind of a call against cowardice, I think. So if you can't fight, what are you doing? It's making individuals who are not able to fight feel bad, so that they will hand over their money. They also have an extremely strong line of xenophobia in them. So this one, the Doolittle men, there was a raid of American airmen on Japanese soil. One of the planes got shot down in China, and 3 of the individuals who were captured were executed. So this poster is sort of taking that and trying to convince people that they can fight the Japanese through their payrolls. So through giving a little bit of their salary every month, you can pay back the Japanese for what they've done. The last is my absolute favorite, which is the shadow of Nazism, the shadow of the swastika over these 3 little children here. What I particularly like about it is the fact that the 2 little boys clearly are ready to fight. So the one with his admiral's hat, and the other with the plane in his hand, while the little girl is sitting on her bottom with her dolly, clearly not capable of fighting at all. And I think this is interesting partly because it misrepresents what finance could do for women, especially in the early modern period. So we'll step back from 20th century finance and go back to the 18th century and think about the last example that I want to give you about what banking and finance does for us. And here is to put power into the hands of the powerless. So this is actually a 19th century representation of the South Sea Bubble of 1720. The South Sea Bubble hit the news a couple of weeks ago because a lot of people mistook it for the worst crisis prior to the coronavirus crisis, because the Bank of England put out a very weird graph that suggested the last time the economy had such a bad patch was 300 years ago, and everybody grasped the South Sea Bubble as being 300 years ago. What happened in the South Sea Bubble was that the government tried very hard to raise a lot of finance very quickly through the South Sea Company. It all went horribly wrong. But throughout the period where it seems to be going right, women were very much engaged with this. So women were actively buying stocks and shares in the South Sea Company. They were actively raising money. You'll see on the left-hand side of the screen, you can just about see her. She's a little bit dark, but there is a woman in the pawn shop selling her jewels to the pawnbroker so that she can then go and buy South Sea shares. But you also see 2 women right in the center talking to the stockbroker there. And this is a fair representation of how women were involved in the South Sea scheme, how they made money, but also how they used it to enact power for themselves, to gain power for themselves. One of the things that's satirized throughout 1720 is the fact that men were being disempowered because women seemed to be able to control finances very much better. They were pushing men out of their sphere. They were acting in ways that allowed them to use finance to take some control of their lives. So there are lots of stories about women trading in South Sea shares so that they could get dowries, so that they could get better husbands. They're about women sort of being trading so that they could become independent, so that they wouldn't need husbands. It doesn't go well for all of them, but it certainly, it certainly does for some. And it highlights a way of women taking control of finance in spheres that are open to them when a lot of other spheres perhaps aren't particularly open to them. So, just check the time. Okay, so I was asked to talk for about half an hour, so I'm going to wrap up and suggest some conclusions now, but I'm more than happy to take questions and expand on some of these other points as well. A lot of the protests around banking suggest precisely this. People put people over banks, humanity before profit, people over markets. It's an interesting proposition, and you can see how these protests are reinforced by the kinds of things that have happened recently, and particularly the 2008 crisis. I think it only tells one bit of the story though, and I think we need to think not only about these bits of the story, but also about the fact that without banks, people would be much worse off than they are now. That banking and high finance has built the economy, and there would have been no capacity to do that without the creation of credit. Throughout the wars of the 18th century, and then the much more crucial wars of the 20th century, high finance was an integral part of the fight. It's a part of the fight that we don't necessarily pay much attention to anymore, but it certainly is there. And that high finance is part of democratization, that power goes with financial capacity. And financial capacity is only available through mediums that allow it to be open to all, that allow people with no money or with little capacity for earning in the present, but for capacity for earning over a period of time, to borrow now in order to spend, to invest, to build businesses, to build homes. And that is my proposition, that banks help people, not just harm them.
Thanks very much, Anne. That was fascinating. It's a very different view of banking than I had thought of.